Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let me just ask you, how many of you were at the morning plenary session? Okay, so a lot of you overall. So you've seen my diploma, right? You know that this actually resembles a diploma. One day this shall be a diploma. But right now this has the list of 1,000 schools in California. And this is not the list of 1,000 schools in California where every student is graduating. This is actually the list. I had to write a bill for it, believe it or not, to basically name names, to force the state of California to just tell us the lowest performing schools in the state of California. Let's go back and think about why this was important and why I wrote the parent trigger bill and why I wrote other pieces of legislation like open enrollment and districts of choice, which also provide for options for choice in public education. You've heard about 6 degrees of separation, right? You've all seen the movie, right? I'm going to talk today about 5 degrees of separation. And these 5 degrees of separation, we all bear them. It's simply zip code. Zip code is what defines how we do public education today. It's landlocked. It's tied to the land. I mean, think about it. That's a notion from feudalism. And feudalism ended a long time ago. The reason why choice in public education is so important is because those 5 digits predict, separate children, mostly poor children, African American children, Latino children, Native children, from the American dream. I can look at a map of California, and based on those 5 digits, I can begin to predict whether or not the child will graduate from high school, whether or not the child will enter a University of California, or more insidiously, whether a child will enter where you find the greatest, quote unquote, affirmative action program of all, the penitentiary system in California. So what do I mean by that? Public education, you all know this is basically across the nation. We talk about local control, and that would be great if our local choices provided us options for our kids to succeed. But instead we're finding disproportionately in California that those 5 digits keep kids in the name of local control, in the name of neighborhood schools, keep our children locked in a system that year after year, generation after generation, decade after decade, in some cases for some of these children, in a school that the federal government has deemed underperforming, I'm going to be more blunt, failing. I look on this list, and as I said this morning, we love to name schools after our heroes. Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks, Jaime Escalante. And yet when I go back and I look at the proficiency rates in too many of our districts located in Latino and African American neighborhoods, on the other side of the tracks, we find that the rates of proficiency, kids, how do they realize the dream? How do you tell a child at Jordan High School today in South Central Los Angeles with a 1% rate of proficiency in mathematics that that kid can truly reach the stars and become an astronaut or become a doctor? 1% rates of proficiency. Garfield High School, East LA, which I represented, 5% of Latina girls. Not at the time when Stand and Deliver was made as a movie, but last year. Only 5% of girls at basic rates of proficiency in mathematics. And yet, you cannot leave the district. We saw the mom in Ohio. To me, this was a mom who stood up for her kids. She did it by having to lie and going to jail because she lied about her zip code, where she lived. So the idea behind fighting for Parent Trigger was one that I believe in public education. And I'm going to fight for public education. But I happen to be a pro-choice Democratic woman, right? And I think if choice is an option for the more affluent and the wealthy, why isn't it good enough for the faces of the students of color and poor children, whether it's California, Illinois, Texas, Florida, you name it? Why can't we give choice to parents in public education? And choice would mean that when, under NCLB, when year after year, and some of these schools have been on this watch list, we just watch, for 12 years, that nothing can be done, and even more importantly, the parents don't even know about it. So I've been launching this Know Your Rights campaign. Education, the civil rights education of our time, we've got to act like it, we've got to mean it. If it means marching, picketing, going to jail, that mother went to jail. Mothers in Compton, California, South Los Angeles, are willing to risk it all to fight for their kids, and they're going up against a very powerful education bureaucracy. They're in the courts, they are lead plaintiffs, they understand that they need to get their kids off of this list and into a college, a university, simply graduating. Today in Compton, California, in the Compton Unified School District, a kid has a 50% greater chance of dropping out than going to college. 50%. And in Compton today, it's overwhelmingly Latino African American. So, inspired by what I saw in Los Angeles, parents organizing. And these were not the PTA parents, mind you. These were really rank and file parents. Many of them church-based, many of them with a fervent belief that social justice mandates that we have education. It's what gives us a shot at simply being equal, accessing the American dream. So I worked with the Civil Rights Coalition. As I said, I'm a Democrat. I understand a great deal of political paralysis in California because in order to get a law passed that basically gives parents more choice in public education, it means overcoming the political powers that be. And I know them well. I was the majority leader of the California State Senate. Money in, favors out. Money in, bills out. And I don't mean with the signatures, I mean, in the graveyard where we file them away in the California State Senate. So I began to take a look at this and say, why can't parents have choice? Now, mind you, I'm also a member of my union. I still voluntarily pay my union dues. I support the Employee Free Choice Act, which basically is card check for people, workers at a workplace to sign a card, form a union, right? Remember Martin Luther King, the night before he was assassinated? Shoulder to shoulder, civil rights and the labor movement. The two can march together into the future. Cesar Chavez, civil rights fighter along with a labor leader. I picketed alongside Cesar Chavez in East Los Angeles many years ago. So I thought, well, if card check is good enough for union members, why don't we have a Parent-Free Choice Act? Why don't we have card check for parents? And essentially, that's the parent trigger. Sign a petition, 50% plus one, boom. In this case, you don't transform the workplace, you transform the school site where your child is going. Basic concept of democracy, 50% plus one, that you begin to see change. So we worked on a coalition, we got the bill through. It, of course, is being litigated in a court of law because the education bureaucracy does not want to see the change because we're comfortable. Adults who run the system have a vested interest in status quo. The child comes in, cha-ching, cha-ching, that's a little debit card, money comes in. We look away from what's been happening for 12 years. Doesn't matter if that school has been listed as a failing school year after year, generation after generation. That's got to change. It's got to change. In California, we find disproportionately, this affects communities of color. It affects poverty communities. California is a state where 7% of the population is African American. 7%. And before I was the chair of the Education Committee, I was the chair of the Prison Reform Committee. So I have been in more prisons in California than you care to imagine. But for nothing that I have done. Let me just make that clear, right?
That's different from Illinois.
Visiting death row. I remember the first time I visited death row in California. I was overwhelmed. And there is no other way to say it but to say the blackness of death row. In a state where the population is 7% of the population, African Americans condemned to death, in California, 40% of death row. And then I look at the math, and I believe in personal responsibility, but the math doesn't add up when 70% of inmates do not have a high school diploma. And when I would talk to inmates, and you take a look at it, lack of reading, lack of education, I'd go back and take a look at it. Zip code, 5 degrees of separation. So, what do we have to do as I wind up here? I believe that parents are the architects of their children's future. My mother had a 6th grade education. I have a PhD. That's the power that education has to transform a life. Even when my high school counselor told me, a kid from the other side of the tracks, I wasn't going anywhere. My mother believed in me. She believed in all her children. She knew that in order for us to just lift ourselves out of poverty, have a chance at the American dream in a landlocked, feudalistic 5 digits of separation, education was the key. You know, I'm sitting here today, and I see mothers and fathers. Too many people say those parents don't care, right? And then when we do care and organize around something like open enrollment or looking at the parent trigger law that enables basically people to say, we the people, we the parents have the right to petition our government. The parent trigger law, finally, it's really not revolutionary. It is an underscoring of laws that exist and yet which the status quo doesn't use. The parent trigger law, the beauty of it is its simplicity. It's revolutionary because it is simple. It says basically, you've got, under federal law, options for a district to turn around, to transform, to convert to a charter by whatever means. Fire the administrator, fire the staff, reopen, restart, transform. You know all the terms. And we said basically the parent trigger says, signing the petition, do it. And this is the option because you, school board leaders, have failed to make that change and relegated our children year after year, generation after generation, like paint, to just sit on a list while we sit back and we wait to see what happens. We know what happens. If we don't educate, we will incarcerate. So that's why I was inspired to write the parent trigger law. I believe in public education. I believe it's worth fighting for. I believe that parents, whether you're rich or poor, whichever side of the tracks you come from, should have greater options for choice so that our children are not assured of simply dropping out of the so-called dropout factory and then we walk away wondering about those children. So I look forward to the conversation. There's much we can do, but make no doubt about it. These changes are not going to come from the top. It's going to be forming old-fashioned civil rights coalitions. You've got partnerships. It's bipartisan. It's involving everyone who cares about understanding that education is the basis for economic prosperity, along with it being the basis of the foundation for civil rights and a civil society. It means a lot of old-fashioned community organizing, but if we understand the power of the parent trigger and the options it provides for inspiring the imagination of parents on behalf of their children, there will be no stopping us. So I look forward to having this conversation in Chicago and wherever we can take it. So thank you for being here today.